Good afternoon, everybody. This is a very unique session which I'm presiding over. You may think that I say so because of the gender issue, but that isn't at all the reason. The reason is because, and I've said that very often in my strategic discussions, that most people in the world are cowards. And that is an essential part on how you fight against anti-Israelism. I find myself in the rare position that I have four courageous persons here behind the table. All four of them, in a certain extent, if they weren't Jewish, you would call them contrarians. They go against what is commonly considered the mainstream opinions. And the statistic probability that in a gathering you have four courageous persons is extremely low. So the first one is Giselle Littman, who better known under her pseudonym Batje Or. And Batje Or found asylum in London in 1957 as a stateless refugee from Egypt. Then she settled with her husband, late Mr. Littman, also a very courageous person in Switzerland. She has written 5 books, so many articles on non-Muslims under Islam. And in fact, if I'm right, Giselle, you introduced the word dhimmi. It's dhimmitude, which now has become a general expression. You sit here with the person who coined that phenomenon and has analyzed it in great detail. And if we today know something about the dhimmi condition of the Jews and the Christians, that's thanks to Batje Or. Her most recent essay, which I think you published, it's from Prague, yeah, my own publisher, is Understanding Dhimmitude from 2013. So I won't be long. I'll ask Batje Or to come up here and to speak about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, primal pillars in Europe's decay, which is a subject, the Europe's decay, very close to my heart.
I would like first to thank Robert Westrich, an old friend, for having organized this extraordinary meeting on a very important subject, most important subject, the issues for Judaism and Israel in the 21st century. I would like also to thank him for having helped me at a moment when I was a rejected author and essayist, and he always supported me. I would like to thank Rabbi Avraham Cooper for the kind words he said, and to evoke also the memory of my late husband, who has supported me in a very difficult fight. In my last book, I wrote that the fight to introduce and popularize the notion of dhimmi and dhimmitude was much more harder, especially among Jews, than the research on the subject and the definition of those notions. But now, since we heard so wonderful, not wonderful, but so extraordinary exposé on the subjects that I wanted to treat, I will not annoy you in repeating you in bad way and bad English what we just heard since yesterday, which was exposed in a magnificent way. So I will only go at random, and please stop me when I go over my time. So, of course, we are facing the new anti-Semitism, and the word anti-Semitism, as Irving Kotler has said, is not the right word to use. And this, the new aspect of this anti-Semitism is that it is global. It comes from two sources: the Christian sources that we know well, which has been very well expressed in a very short sentence by a father of the church, Saint Augustine, in the 4th century, who said that the Jews, since they refused to recognize Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, are condemned forever to live a slave among the nations. And this, of course, is a condemnation and of the state of Israel. It is not only a theological expression of hatred, but also political. It has the two aspects, theological and political. And in fact, this idea was repeated in the 1920s by the Pope then to oppose Zionists, to oppose the recognition by the League of Nations of the legitimacy of the national homeland for Jews in Palestine. We have seen now with other speakers that this refusal of the legitimacy of the state of Israel on theological reasons continue till today. In the previous session, it has been demonstrated that Jews are the state of Israel is not a legitimate, is the representative of an evil embodiment because it doesn't recognize Jesus. But there is another, I would say that this aspect has been for some time limited. But there is another aspect which is very important to know in anti-Zionism, which is Islamic, the Islamic aspect. And in Islam, Jews, the state of Israel is refused in the context of jihad. So Israel is not the only country whose sovereignty on its homeland is refused. It is among all the other countries who are not Muslims and whose legitimacy is fought against. And this is why we are living, maybe you people are not aware of that because they don't know exactly the ideology and laws and tactics of jihad, except, of course, the specialists. We are living in a global jihad. So anti-Semitism has become global because we are living also in a global jihad, not only against Israel, against Europe, against Christians in Nigeria, against Christians in other countries, in Muslim countries. And the problem of the Jews and the problem of Israel is linked to this aspect of global jihad. However, the Jews are, I would say, in the eye of the tsunami, in the eye of the storm. There are the ones who are the most attacked because they represent also, they represent the enemy to destroy in order to destroy Christianity, which is the biggest enemy also of Islam, of the Islamists. So you destroy Israel, you destroy the basis of Israel, and then you destroy also Christianity, since it is founded on Jewish theology, on on the First Testament, and on Jewish values. And you destroy what is now the aim of the Islamists. You destroy the Judeo-Christian civilization. So what I would like to point out is that, in fact, in discussing all those different aspects together about Judaism, we are, in fact, taken into a global war against the Judeo-Christian civilization, the Jewish values, Christian values, all what our civilization has built. And if we lose this war, civilization will disappear. And this war is on all continents. It's not only against Israel, it is on all continents. So it is important to understand the mechanism of this war and to understand also how it developed, and also how are the issues. And by knowing who are the forces behind this war, and how it advances, we shall, and what are the forces in movement, we shall be able to oppose it. But if we consider that we are just, things happen like that fortuitously, one day there is this incident, another day there is another incident. We don't see the linkage, we don't see the aim, we don't see the strategy, then we will be the victim and we will not be able to fight back. So now I was asked why I was optimist. I am optimist because I see that people now are awakened, that they see the dangers, they get together, they discuss about it, and therefore this makes me optimist, because when we realize a problem, you try to find a solution. Now I would like to say that how all this has happened, why Europe, we are dealing now with the Islamized Europe. It is not the old Europe. And how all this has happened, why we are now in 2014 living in Islamized countries, Islamized Europe. Well, this has started. It has a long history, but this long history of anti-Semitism has been said already, and I will not want to repeat it. I will only say things that has not been said. And I think that the person who gave the letter, the noblesse to anti-Zionism is General de Gaulle, as my friend Michel Gerfinkel said it. Since the decolonization of Algeria, General de Gaulle wanted to have to break or to distance itself from Israel and to link France with the Arab world, because of course France has a big patrimony, historical patrimony in the Arab countries, which were very anti-French then because of the war of decolonization in the Maghreb. So he wanted to build a policy of a Mediterranean policy of linkage of Europe. At this time, it was the European Community, 7 countries, then which grew to 9 countries, and with the Arab world. So he asked his former minister, Louis Terre-Noire, to create a network of Franco-Arab friendship and France Pays Arabe, and also a review on that. And of course, with the support of the state, of the government, Gaullist government, and with the funding of for this rapprochement with the Arab world. So we see all those anti-Semite, all those anti-Semitic trends that were discussed before, getting together, becoming Gaullist and supporting the policy of General de Gaulle. But General de Gaulle died in 1970, but of course before dying, he said his famous media conference on the 27th November 1967, where he said that the main aim of French foreign policy was to build up its a Franco-Arab solidarity. So with this, therefore, the French policy changed, and in 1969, the PLO opened a representation in Paris. But General de Gaulle wanted also, with Adenauer, wanted also to create a common foreign policy of the European community. And henceforth, for 6 years, he tried to impress on the other member states of the European community to join him in his anti-Israeli policy, which they refused because they say that it was too biased. But after 6 years of PLO terrorism in Europe and the oil boycott in October 1973, the other countries joined France, and there was a declaration, the Declaration of Brussels, in November 1973, whereby the community recognized the PLO, recognized the Palestinians, and also the Arafat. So this has been, from this moment, everything has changed in Europe. Because, first of all, there was 2 bodies that were created. The European Association for Euro-Arab Cooperation, on the European side, promoted by the European Commission and funded by the European Commission, which is the highest body of and power in Europe. And then on the other side, the Arabs, the Interparliamentarian Association. So these 2 bodies, one under the Arab Leagues, promoted by the Arab Leagues. So these 2 bodies met regularly, created committee and subcommittee that had planned exactly the Europe that we are seeing now. For instance, one of the review that this body, the PAEC, European Parliamentarian Association, published was Arabia, and it was promoted, of course, by the Arabia Committee. And in this review, which dated, it was number 2, I have it at home. In this review, it was requested from the European community to boycott the produce from the territory, the disputed territory, Judea and Samaria, in 1975. Now, my daughter gave me a little article in Haaretz, which appeared 3 days ago, where EU won't import poultry from settlements. So we are wrong when we think that those bodies, the European Association for Euro-Arab Cooperation, is a means organization that didn't have any effect on policy. In fact, by strange ways, the summary of the activities of this association reached me. It was in a mysterious way, but it came to me, and I have it. And it declared there that, in fact, it was responsible for the Declaration of Venice issued by the European Community in 1980. And this Venice declaration is in fact the worst declaration issued by the European Community, which set up the borderlines of Israel on pre-1967 lines. So you see, this, in fact, it is very interesting to see how politics are done, because politics, but maybe I will come on that later, because this is also part of the problem of Europe and of the Jews. I want to say that the guidelines here, the guidelines that were given by the former leaders of the European Community on Israel are based on the work of this unknown body, which is the European Association of European Parliamentarian Association. Anyway, I don't want to be too long on that, because there are more important things to say. I want to say that why this why this decision, the anti-Israeli policy chosen in 1973 under the pressure of France, why it has repercussion on Europe. Well, because this same association had two missions, as it said in his report. One was to fight against Israel and promote the Palestinians, and the other was to promote immigration. In the same way as it fought against Israel, it fought against the Europe, the old Europe we know, in order to introduce the Islamic immigration, open-door Islamic immigration, multiculturalism, spreading of Islam and Islamic culture, and in a way, so it was very active, a very important tool in destroying the Europe that we know. The Europe that we knew, because the Europe of today is a Europe who has lost its identity. The same policy that it promotes against Israel, negating its identity as Mr. Kotler said about anti-Zionism, the negation of identity, of history, of biblical archaeology, as I saw it in European Museum, in London and Paris Museum, where the history of Israel, the archaeological artifacts which are exposed, for instance, in the siege of Lachish, are presented as Palestinian war. So everything is Palestinized, as we have seen there. And this will be my conclusion, that the main body which is directing this policy is the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Everything we have seen is coming from the Organization of Islamic Conference, and the European leaders are just the dhimmi, the servant at the service of this organization that aims to Islamize the Western world. For instance, the very interesting expose of Giovanni on the Kairos Declaration, the Kairos Palestinian, which is dated 2009, is coming from a conference, two conferences that were given, one in Rabat in 2002, the other in 2004 in Amman, which expose exactly this plan, which has been applied in the Kairos activities. So it is very important for scholars to go to the site of the OIC to see what they say, what are their activities, and to make a comparison with what the Christians say, the church says, how they act. And it will be helpful for us and for the Christians and for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Giselle. Our next speaker is Professor Ami Eilman, Professor of Political Science and the William Weber Chair of Social Science at Kalamazoo College. I asked Amy why she didn't mention, because we met for the first time when she was at Harvard. She said, well, at Harvard I had nobody to talk to because she was in the European department. So she has published on the response of various states and the European Union to issues of citizenship, migration, sex, discrimination, and anti-Semitism. Her book, The European Union, Anti-Semitism and the Politics of Denial, University of Nebraska Press, was sponsored by the Vidal Sassoon Center. It explores the circumstances that obliged European political institutions to take action against anti-Semitism and considers the effectiveness of the interventions by reference to two seemingly different member states, Austria and Sweden. Amy.
I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here with all of you. And were it not for SICSA, I don't know that I would have had the support to continue on with this work. And I know that I speak for many of us when I say that. I'm going to just focus on the European Union's efforts in the last year. Can you hear me? No. Barely. How's that?
The mic is collapsing. So
the mic is collapsing.
We need technical help.
Thank you. How's that? Now, when the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency released its survey report on anti-Semitism in 2013, a decade had passed since its predecessor, the European Union Monitoring Center, or the EUMC, attempted to shelve its findings on the same subject. So let me tell you this. If it appears that the European Union has come far since then to acknowledge the pervasiveness of a problem that it earlier endeavored to deny, consider this. The agency that just released the report, the Fundamental Rights Agency, is the same agency that withdrew its predecessor's working definition of anti-Semitism from its website and then insisted that the definition never really existed. Then, within 2 months of the disappearance of that definition, one that carefully delineated anti-Zionism's anti-Semitic dimensions, the European Commission, which is the EU's executive body, banned funding for Israeli institutions in those territories it defined as occupied. Days later, as if to play an even hand, the EU's Council, which is comprised of all 28 member states, let me go back. Days later, as if to play an even hand, the EU's 28 member states, under what's called the European Council, added Hezbollah's so-called military wing to a list of terrorist organizations precluded from receiving any direct or indirect financial assistance. These seemingly unrelated pivots might defy explanation were they not in keeping with a pattern that I'll identify and is legally known as bait and switch. Rescinding the definition of anti-Semitism before issuing a report on the subject is similar to sanctioning Israel before censuring Hezbollah's military wing. Each seemingly even-handed pair of actions is in fact deeply imbalanced. The first undercuts the rights of Jews to live in peace, whether as EU nationals or as a nation, while the second offers what I refer to as virtual redress to the adversaries of anti-Semitism. Alluring and often insincere remedies can inspire satisfaction, particularly among those reticent to emerge from a political transaction with nothing at all. But such redress does not abate harm. I'll make the argument that it actually exacerbates it. To those for whom such deceits of bait and switch can seem minor, the Nobel Prize-winning economist George Akerlof explains, and I quote, "Those who wish to pawn bad wares as good wares tend to drive out legitimate business." Now, I want you to understand that then the cost of dishonesty lies not only in the amount by which the purchaser is cheated. The cost must also include the loss incurred from driving legitimate businesses out of existence. Akerlof's insights extend to the EU's increasingly tarnished legislative arena, in which Europe's political actors have sold its Jewish nationals, their organizations, and the Jewish state questionable policies, demonstrating how and by whom Jews have been played might afford, I hope, some remedy. So my paper explores the EU's recent efforts to identify and counter prejudice against Jews. It includes the EU's informal, and I stress informal, adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism. It also touches on the formal sanctions against Israeli institutions, and then its ostensible censure of Hezbollah. Out of the three, you'll know that the only thing that was real were, again, the formal sanctions against Israeli institutions. Given time constraints, I want to focus on the politics surrounding the apparent adoption of and dissemination of the working definition of anti-Semitism, and consider how far from offering Jews potential redress, it provided the illusion of relief and offered none. Addressing anti-Semitism within the EU first requires that we reveal the deceptions surrounding it. Key among these is that the European polity has long been and continues to remain active in the fight against anti-Semitism. Like racism in general, anti-Semitism was seen by Europe's leading architects as an internal national problem that the European community had little interest in and no substantive authority to address. It was not, in fact, until even this century that any EU institutions focused exclusively, or I would even say primarily, on the very discrimination that had decades ago brought the continent to its knees. Even today, anti-Semitism remains one of the few forms of discrimination to have escaped the notice of the European Court of Justice, which is the EU's final arbiter of EU law. It was instead, and it has been addressed by, the European Monitoring Center and the Fundamental Rights Agency. I'll start with the EUMC, which is the predecessor agency. You need to know that when the European Commission, the key administrative body of the EU, considered that center's establishment in 1996, the memo establishing it explained, and I quote, "The point is not to take specific measures to combat racism or xenophobia. Indeed, the Commission insisted that it would, quote, not modify the system for protecting human rights in the community or in any of its member states. Whatever appearances to the contrary, the center actually stayed true to its original mission." The next year, the center's charge was clarified in a regulation that called on it to, quote, provide the community and the member states with objective, reliable, and comparable data on racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. In the case of anti-Semitism, the center remained a largely untapped source to discuss anti-Semitism until after 9/11, and until then, it barely monitored the problem. Now, having already proclaimed anti-Muslim discrimination their top concern following 9/11, the center lacked the political clout, if not will, to also address that cataclysm's fueling of anti-Semitism and recognize that the far right's traditional victims had become, at least in many of the member states, anti-Semitism's leading proponents. Instead of confronting this complexity, the center tried in vain to suppress data relating to it. And hence, when researchers from the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism drafted a synthesis report concluding that the most violent attacks against Jews were tied to virulent anti-Zionism, then and now, by the way, and to perpetrators who were above all either right-wing extremists or radical Islamists or young Muslims of Arab descent, the center referred to the research as methodologically unsound and to the findings as divisive. That strategy backfired once experts released their draft report and actually exposed the European Union Center's countless efforts to alter these results. Ironically, the most notable aspect of the Center's 2003 report on anti-Semitism was the controversy it generated when folks tried to shelve it. Nonetheless, its dubious revisions prior to even its eventual release are also remarkable. For instance, the center expunged evidence of the extreme left's role in violent attacks against Jews in Denmark and against Jews in Sweden. The center similarly deleted a reference from the draft report about Swedish Nazis who enthusiastically embraced Islamic anti-Semites. And most fundamentally, and similar edits are congenial to the EU's center-left elite, whose indulgence of left-leaning and Islamic anti-Semitism is nothing less than remarkable. The edits virtually erased the existence of anti-Semitism on the left and from Islamic sources. Placing prejudice to the extreme right, as so many of us might be inclined to do, especially after yesterday's elections, placing prejudice to the extreme right of the political continuum and linking it to nationalism is problematic because it lets a self-satisfied left off the hook and implies, wrongly, that Europe's integration is an antidote to anti-Semitism. Now, angered by the European Center's manipulation of data and its reticence to acknowledge the changing cast of anti-Semitism's leading characters, the European Jewish Congress and others publicly denounced that 2003 report. Exposed as inadequate to monitor and analyze a prejudice that it did not understand and had never bothered to define, the Center enlisted the assistance of several Jewish organizations and leading scholars in formulating what we now refer to as the working definition of anti-Semitism. Soon after, the Center presented the subsequent definition to participants at a follow-up conference in Cordova, where it was immediately received, though it's very important that you realize, never formally adopted. Again, the definition was never formally adopted. Now, knowing little, if anything, about the mechanics of the EU's legislative process, and thus expecting that the definition might oblige member states to combat anti-Semitism, Jewish organizations and various state actors, I would say perhaps especially those outside of Europe, hailed that definition. Particularly impressive was its thoughtful delineation of anti-Zionism's anti-Semitic dimensions. But because the definition was never attached to any legal instrument, not a decision, not a directive, a regulation, not even a recommendation, it lacked legal standing. It had no traction. In auto terms, its body was Lamborghini, its motor was Hugo. Thus, by 2008, the American Jewish Committee's European Forum on Anti-Semitism found that, and I quote, many Jewish community and NGO leaders involved in monitoring anti-Semitism remained unaware of the working definition. Now, part of the problem was it was never translated. So rather than translate the working definition for the adoption throughout member states, or call upon the Commission or its colleagues in the European Parliament to at least recommend it, as, by the way, the Center Against Racism does for other groups whose interests it claims to represent, the Center disseminated its English-only text only to its own research network, and it did nothing else to promote it. Indeed, the definition, the working definition of anti-Semitism appeared in none of the EU Center's annual reports that detail important developments and responses to discrimination. When I asked about the definition's conspicuous absence from the EU's myriad documents, an official from the Fundamental Rights Agency, previously the EUMC, insisted that, and I quote, the definition is merely a work in progress. And not surprisingly, this same official who works for the Fundamental Rights Agency, who is the same guy who is responsible for the above-noted revisions to the 2003 report. No novice in the intricacies of EU anti-discrimination politics, he's actually rather adept at what I refer to as Eurospeak. He explains that as a work in progress, the working definition of anti-Semitism required testing and further comment throughout the community before its practical use and effectiveness could be established and then supported fully. Yet by repeatedly ignoring the working definition, by never translating it, and refusing to issue that definition in any of the agency's reports, its effectiveness could never be determined, never be tested, and supported fully. Let me argue that that was precisely the point. By 2009, when the Center became the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, a title that coincided with that Center's expanded responsibilities for fundamental rights, it had come no closer to acknowledging, much less revising or supporting the working definition of anti-Semitism, so that like the Center before it, the Fundamental Rights Agency deflects attention from that transnational polity's flaws by heaping praise on its more mediocre accomplishments. Consider, for example, what the Fundamental Rights Agency personnel actually knew as they touched down in Jerusalem last spring versus the brochure that they published and then distributed at the 4th International Conference of the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism. That personnel knew that 73% of those Jewish nationals it surveyed identified online anti-Semitism as a rather significant problem. Rather than addressing this growing scourge and the shortcomings of the Commission's then 2008 decision to combat Holocaust denial and hate speech, the agency distributed a brochure entitled, you can't make any of this up, Human Rights Education at Holocaust Memorial Sites Across the European Union. Disinterested in Holocaust denial as a manifestation of anti-Semitism, which, by the way, was the subject of that conference last spring, the Fundamental Rights Agency's chief concern, at least as expressed explicitly in the brochure, was this, and I quote, "Most of the memorial sites do not systematically include education on human rights in their work." If ever one doubted if Jewish rights are human rights, the Fundamental Rights Agency's approach to Holocaust education provides an illuminating answer. Jewish concerns and the destruction of Europe's Jews do not constitute human rights violations, and our interests do not apparently coincide with fundamental rights. Given this profound shortcoming, it is little wonder that the working definition of anti-Semitism languished on the Fundamental Rights Agency's website as it issued two brief overviews concerning anti-Semitism, one published in 2009, the other in 2011. Both lamented that because so few member state authorities had bothered to define anti-Semitism, there was a dearth of statistical data relating to it. Now, this was an odd admission because the Center's earlier informal adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism might have resolved this conundrum had it bothered to properly translate and disseminate that work. Nonetheless, the agency revisited, without the least irony, the methodological quandaries that stem from reporting a problem its researchers had yet to define. Then, just months prior to releasing its latest and most comprehensive report on anti-Semitism in 2013, the Fundamental Rights Agency quietly withdrew the definition from its website. That act was first reported by the pro-Palestinian website Electronic Intifada. By the time Europe's Jewish community and its allies discovered the definition's disappearance and then appealed to the agency to reinstate it, a Fundamental Rights Agency spokeswoman insisted, and I quote, that she was not, quote, aware of any official definition. Moreover, she submitted, and I quote, "The agency does not need to develop its own definition of anti-Semitism to research these issues," end of quote. Despite the outcry that these answers provoked, you must understand that she was technically correct. The EU had never adopted an official and therefore legal definition of anti-Semitism, and its 2013 report testified to the research that could be done without one. Advocates against anti-Semitism had been misdirected. They had wrongly assumed that a working definition posted to an official EU website constituted an authoritative act. Moreover, and in spite of evidence to the contrary, some outspoken opponents of anti-Semitism insisted that the definition offered an effective weapon in the arsenal against anti-Semitism. No doubt well-meaning, the insistence on EU redress by Jewish organizations where none exists is politically dangerous, and it allows for us to be further duped. Indeed, Jews were seriously played. For example, when the measure's proponents mobilized for the definition's reinstatement several months ago, Members of the European Parliament joined in, although they are in a privileged position to appreciate the limitations of their symbolic demand. Absent the formal definition, formal adoption of the working definition on the legislative table, redress remains virtual. This fact is obscured by the grand gestures of European politicians and bureaucratic shills in a seemingly endless shuffle of bait-and-switch anti-Semitism and symbolic amends. Let me conclude. I began with the assertion that tracking anti-Semitism within the EU necessitates that we reveal the deceptive gestures that inhibit the possibility of doing so. I focused on one effort, the working definition, that proved so elusive that its existence could later be denied. But allow me to suggest that while the definition's chief limitation was its lack of legal standing, its greatest asset was its clear depiction of anti-Zionism's anti-Semitic manifestations. As was alluded to earlier by Manfred Gerstenfeld, appreciating this aspect of the working definition helps to account for the timing of its withdrawal from the website. The agency withdrew it shortly before the Commission sanctioned Israeli institutions in those territories the EU claims it does not consider to be part of Israel's territory. Then, after rescinding something that legally could have been used to emphasize the EU's own anti-Semitism, then the EU's Council censured Hezbollah's military wing. The first gesture established the EU's disapproval of Israel, while the second suggested that the EU was an ally of Israel nonetheless. However, in censuring a non-existent faction of Hezbollah, the EU may continue to fund the organization by streaming money into its phantom non-military wing. Moreover, the EU's charade lends diplomatic credibility to its purported political wing, an act that emboldens terrorists everywhere. In the aftermath of the EU's censure of Hezbollah's military wing, the AJC's press statement read, and I quote, "Half a loaf is better than none." Perhaps there were those who similarly thought that a symbolic definition on a website was also better than nothing. However, each time we express satisfaction with second-rate wares, we cheat ourselves by, as Akerlof noted, by driving legitimate solutions to anti-Semitism off the table. By contrast, substantive as opposed to symbolic redress demands nothing less than exposing the fraudulent machinations of the European polity and not accepting the bait of half measures. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. I can only regret that the EU ambassador isn't here. He is the main propagandist of Europe in Israel. And he already walked out when I showed statistics a couple of weeks ago. So if he had heard just these two lectures, he might be at the beginning of a necessary re-education. The next speaker is Alexandra Leniel-Lavastine, formerly Löwenstein. She is a French researcher, PhD, philosopher. She has been teaching at universities. She told me that she is one of the 3 most non grata persons in Romania because she has exposed the fallacy of Romanian intellectuals and their past. She has written several books about Eastern European intellectuals under communism and fascism. She's a Holocaust historian, Romania-Ukraine. She recently translated and edited Matatias Karp, book, which is a parallel to Ringelblum, about the destruction of Romanian Jewry, a book written between 1940 and 1945. She has also been, for a long time, a journalist for Le Monde, when that was still possible for a sensible person to be a journalist of that paper. And she is responsible for a collection at the Grasset Publishing House in France. Alexander.
Well, as Amy, I would like first to say how happy I am to be here, thanks to the Center and to Professor Westrich. Well, a lot have been said today. I would like to start with maybe a prophetical comment from French philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich. He was a comment going back to 71, but sadly very up to date. Yankelevich was then already pointing out that anti-Semitism is nothing but a justified or licit version of anti-Semitism. And he, I quote, "It allows everybody to be democratically anti-Semite." And what he adds, if Jews were becoming themselves natives, he says it would be great. I mean, it wouldn't be necessary to have pity for them anymore, as they obviously deserved what happened to them. End of the quotation. Well, since then, that is about 45 years ago again, it seems that this very pessimistic prophecy has been fully fulfilled, I think, even beyond, we could say, all expectations. And to the point that in France today, I would say, like my colleagues this morning, that anti-Zionist is really part of the political correctness. I mean, it's not only authorized, it's frankly popular and trendy. You know, it's true in our colorful outskirts, but it's also true among mainstream intellectuals or media or in the public space, let's say, at large. So, considering the degree of pathology, I think, we've reached today, especially, I think, during the 15 past years, I think anti-Zionism has is definitely to prove that it is definitely a kind of repackaged version of anti-Semitism. In the sense that, you know, Israel is not obsessive and hated as, you know, a state whose policy can be, of course, criticized as in any kind of democracy. I mean, Israel is really hated as a country of the Jews. In other words, I think we have obviously reached a new stage, if not a new age, as you were putting it, Shmuel, this morning, of anti-Semitism in Europe. So now I would like to raise the following question. What's really new? I think the context first. I mean, we've been talking about it a lot. We have, I think, a new age since, let's say, I mean, the beginning of the 21st century, since the fall of communism, with the revival of the extreme left in Europe, which was not so proud before, but again, coming back again. And of course, I mean, with the beginning of the second Intifada and 9/11 and its aftermath, and also with the expanding and radicalization of a part of European Muslim immigration, even among the second generation, with the spread of anti-Jewish hatred through the web and also through TV channels, Arabic TV channel, which is very important, even if I would not talk yet about an Islamized Europe. But we have maybe some disagreement here. I don't think we are still to that point. So I think this context is also very important to understand a second turning point. I mean, the fact that anti-Semitism has clearly and mostly switched, at least in France, from the established classical nationalist, let's say, far-right for as a national front. To the other side. I mean, in the 80s, we were used to fight against Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen jokes about the crematoriums, for instance, you know, and in the death camps. Or now, I think it is really a fact, I mean, unless you're totally blind, that since about 15 years, this anti-Jewish discourse has explicitly moved to the far left. And as you know, in France, the left has a problem with its extreme wing, which is in a way, it's kind of superego, we could say, for historical and sociological reasons. You know, the extreme left in that sense sort of indicates a political correctness direction. So just to take, you know, a recent and revealing example, again, we were talking about this morning, I mean, these jours de colère we had in January, Day of Anger. It's quite interesting because this demonstration took place in Paris, and it gathered about, I don't know, 20,000 persons, and with slogans like Jews out or Jews, France is not yours, and so on. And who was there? I mean, we can talk about a motley crowd of, you know, mixing some with some crazy Salafists, let's say, some neo-Nazi skinheads, some fanatic Catholics, some leftist, very well assumed, some inferior small employers, some hooligans from the suburbs. I mean, they would all agree to be together because they are all against the Jews. So, I mean, right or left, it's very difficult to say. And my feeling is that these categories, maybe they don't make sense to most of these people. It requires a little bit of culture, right, left, what it means. But maybe they don't make sense anymore either to us. I mean, to understand this nauseating very new phenomenon. And I would rather see here a kind of, I don't know, ideological morass, but we should find a more, you know, scientific term for it. Where in a way, all the French and European crises are sort of converging. Fear of globalization expanding, deep concern from a population. This is, I think, also very important, getting older and older in Europe. We have also other elements like fragmented communities, school disaster, dreadful lack of culture, intellectual blindness, public powerlessness, and so on. I mean, as a result of this smelly zeitgeist, I think that, I mean, as you know, for the very first time since World War II, Ben was talking this morning about deadly violence. So for the very first time, Jews have been killed on the French territory because they were Jews. You remember, of course, the horrible killings of Mohamed Merah, of Muslim soldiers and Jewish children in the school, and before also the murder of this young man called Ilan Halimi, who was horribly tortured and murdered by a guy called Fofana and his gang of barbarians. But what is very interesting is that both these killers are considered as absolutely heroes in our outskirts. And I know what I am talking about because I'm living in the outskirts since about 30 years. So this is the most concerning aspect of it. It's also interesting with the Merah killings to note that let's say the Republican or the moderate liberal right was much more clear and much more at ease in firmly condemning these horrors, probably because they don't have this third worldist ideology preventing, you know, sort of access to the real. Of course, I mean, if you study the press coverage, most of the left would not approve of these killings. But, you know, they would rather see in this crime some isolated and unrepresentative events. And still, a few weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, and to give you an idea, you know, the film maker Alexandre Arcadi, who just made a film about Ilan Halimi murder, was invited on a very mainstream TV show. And in front of him was this guy, a French guy, good-looking, called Caron, you know, and he sort of, you know, with fact sheets in hands, he started talking about a long list of Palestinian children, I mean, killed by the horrible Israeli soldiers, though justifying racist crimes in the name of anti-racism, as we were telling before. But I mean, one wonders what kind of relationship with the murder of Ilan Halimi, Palestinian children, and so it was really justifying, and this sequence was finally cut and not broadcasted. I mean, we were on a public channel, so it was a little bit touchy. But the guy is still there. I mean, he should have been fired in a normal, healthy society, as Sterling, for instance, a famous American player, was recently fired because of his disgusting statements about black people. This TV French guy is not mad. He's not at all a sort of exception either. It's just very representative of the reluctancy for many left-wing intellectuals, and it is my political family, so I'm very sad about it, to put their watch on time. And to acknowledge and to see what they see. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And he also embodies very well what Shmuel Trigano properly calls Islamo-gauchism, Islamic left, I don't know, how would you say in English? A mixture of his, yes. So, once again, if we raise the question, what's new? I will follow by trying to distinguish 5 different lines in Europe. Broadly, I think, not only parallel lines, but also broadly converging or lines, which is really not good news at all. The first one, as I previously mentioned, is the rise and spread of Islamic fundamentalism in Western Europe countries. Since about 15 years, we've been talking a lot about it already. It's also, I think, not ready to slow down, as we are also facing, European society, a very deep crisis of integration. I mean, our societies are a little bit disintegrating, so when a society is disintegrating, it gets very difficult for the society to integrate, I think, new peoples. And it is to the point that it really requires now in Paris a great amount of courage to defend the state of Israel. I mean, many of my friends have now bodyguards given by the national police, I mean, which was not the case about 5 years ago. The second line is what I would not hesitate to call the moral failure of the anti-racist ideology, which could make sense, of course, in the 80s, for instance, but which is now really evolving towards an anti-Jewish speech stated in the name of the other, which is the worst. I mean, and the other is not always right, contrary to what Claudio Magris always says. The other is always right. Well, not the case, I think. So I think we have here in Europe a kind of also behind this, long-standing self-hatred, revived by the reactivation of the extreme right about a decade after the fall of communism, and now mixed with some old third worldist and new anti-globalist elements. And for these people, the frame, I mean, it is really simple. I mean, it's only necessary to be able to count to two, the dominated and the dominators. On one side, you have the good ones, that is the immigrants, the victims, immigrants especially from Arabic and African countries, the poor, the disadvantaged people, and the oppressed one. And on the other side, on the bad side, you have the oppressors, the colonizers, and the very naughty whites, especially Jews. And I think, and the idea is that nothing can come from the good ones. Nothing bad can come from the good ones for a part of our left. And this is why, I mean, it is so stubbornly refusing to engage into clear critique of radical Islam. And its atrocities when some enlightened Muslim intellectuals do, on the reverse, are extremely severe, but we don't listen to them, and they are quite, put aside. So it's quite of a paradox. And this phenomenon, I think, is also visible in this memory, quite recent also, memory competition. I mean, with this idea that the Jews are always the most favored nation, including when they are getting, the best, and which is the case for these people in their mind. They are getting the best and the biggest part of the available compassion in our societies, contrary to the others, that is, slave or colonized descendants. The third line, it seems to me, lies on the now very widespread multiculturalist ideology, theorized in the 90s mostly by authors like Charles Taylor or Michael Walzer, to take the smartest ones. At that time, we were quite many intellectuals to think that, yes, maybe, communism is at last over, and maybe time has come to try to imagine maybe a rugged version of the Enlightenment, capable to make some more room for cultural identities, provided, of course, that the particular features of the different communities would always have to be second, that is subjected to or subordinated to universal values. But I now think that we were much too optimistic by then, and that this seducing view was a kind of mistake. And that it really has, disastrous consequences in many countries in Europe, like England or Germany, to the delight, which is not good news either, of the new populist European movements, very successful since the beginning of the new century, too. Now, the fourth, the fourth convergent line stands, I would say, and we did not talk much about it today, in our, I would say, quite almost in a biblical sense, our fall into globalization. European people were not, I think, prepared at all, and they suddenly, realized with some terror and panic in a way that they were not the authors of their own collective existence anymore, that the future is getting more and more uncertain, and that globalization can be also destructive, and that we are now more like pushed in the back to innovate and innovate again and again. Nobody really knows why, and then really choosing the path, the progressive path we want to engage in. And seen from Europe, this aspect is very important, I would say, also to understand this new anti-Semitism we're all trying to define, because there is this idea, that, as if, the more European society have the feeling that their destiny is getting out of hands, the more they need somebody pulling the strings behind the stage. And this plot obsession, very successful, sort of reconcile communities together in the same ideological back porridge. Though the fifth line, I would say, is the rise and success, and we should not forget about it, of new national populist movements all over Europe, East and West, for about 10 years. And it's interesting to observe that their political success and audience sort of follow the same curve than the radicalization of Islam. In a way, they are feeding each other's. And they have also something else in common. They are both at war with the European idea. In Hungary, also, I mean, we noticed that a Jobbik, neo-Nazi deputy, stood up in the parliament during, I think it was during the strikes in Gaza about a year and a half ago. It's interesting, the connection, strikes by Sahel, and this guy standing up asking that, it would be time to have a list of the Jewish people in the government with a name and address and so on. And I was recently in Budapest, and I was sitting in the bus, and I could hear this commentary of a guy. We were crossing the local Chinatown, and I heard a guy saying to his neighbor, "Look at all these disgusting yellow Jews." I mean, this is like, the cool one. And so we see here that we have many bridges between far left and far right, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. And for instance, in Belgium, it was very clear not very long ago, both extremes were at least coherent for once and demonstrating together, shouting Jews to the gas. And it was also during some events here with the Palestinians. So, and now we have also in Europe the Ukrainian situation. So, I mean, where a country where absolutely no work has been made on the mass killing of Jews, and they totally love now, and they invented recently this parallel between Holocaust and Holodomor. Holodomor referring to the Great Famine in 1933, and they call it Holodomor, like we have the Shoah and the Nakba, and Taguieff started to talk about Judeophobia, and then Islamophobia arrived. I mean, always the same trivialization story. I think also that in Eastern European society there is another factor we did not much talk about, but I think it's important, and I think it amplifies their, let's say, classical anti-Judaism. That is, I mean, the difficulty these societies deal with their past, the difficult way they deal with their pasts after decades of dictatorships, and especially with communism, I mean, with all the compromises that it involved. And we observe there a real temptation to deal with this quite uncomfortable legacy by designating again the Jews as responsible for it. I mean, which this explains the success of new notions like Red Holocaust or communist genocide, or once again, I mean, how to get rid of it. So all these three lines, I think, are converging, and yes, okay, and. We were talking, well, I will make it short. We have already been talking about Dieudonné this morning. Well, he's obviously, I mean, an anti-Semite. He says that Jews are dogs, that in his shows or on TV, that they were slave traders, and from slave traders they became bankers, that they brought AIDS in Africa, and so on and so on. The real scandal broke out when our Ministry of Interior decided to prohibit his shows. So, I mean, and this guy is not a problem in himself. I mean, it's just, it would be a problem of mental illness or something like that. But the problem is that he has a huge public audience in the outskirts, but also among teachers, for instance. Yes, just to conclude, maybe two remarks and one big interrogation. Going back to philosopher Yankelevich, I was quoting at the beginning, he had also the following sentence. He was writing, "A time may come when laughing about Auschwitz may become an opinion." And yes, it was right. Time has come when singing Shoah Nanas, Dieudonné's favorite song, and very popular now, is supposed to be extremely funny and warranted it's the name of freedom of speech. And yes, this time is our time. Now, the big question behind all this, in my eyes, is maybe the following. Should we see, and it's also referring to what you were saying, Amy. Should we see in all this a sign of the schizophrenic or a sign of the suicidal tendencies of democratic Europe? As if Europe, with this strange obstinacy not to exist, was sort of torn between shame and hatred or self-hatred. That for many Europeans, I think that still the crime, the Holocaust, is definitely too heavy to bear, and the responsibility probably too overwhelming. Or again, how to get rid of it, all the more in a globalized context, inspiring, as I was saying before, a deep uneasiness to many Europeans. And, well, just to finish, I think one thing is beyond any doubt, is that a society that tolerates within it and up to this point, anti-Semitism is really a society, and maybe we could talk about a continent, Europe, that is just threatening itself, and with it the very roots of humanist Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. Our last speaker is Melanie Phillips, who is, what can I say, first of all, a courageous person. To do what she does in England is not done. It's not politically correct to tell the truth in England. It's simply, you don't do that. She's a British journalist, author, broadcaster. She's best known for her polemical column about political and social issues, which at present appears weekly in The Times. She's a regular panelist on the BBC's radio The Moral Maze. She appears frequently on BBC's TV Question Time and Daily Politics Show, and her blog can be found at www.mbooks.com. Her book, Londonistan, which she is fortunate that there is no censorship in England which can forbid such books, about the British establishment capitulation to Islamic aggression, can really be recommended to everybody who wants to have an insight what really goes on in England. It was published in 2006. She has written other books, The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth and Power, Guardian Angel. The memoir of her personal and political journey was published in 2013 by her own electronic imprint, M-Books. Melanie.
Thank you, Manfred. Hello, everybody. It's a very great pleasure to be here among such wonderful people from whom I continue to learn so much, not least Robert Wistrich himself. And we've been hearing today one inspired and erudite presentation after another, exploring the madness over Israel that preoccupies us and worries us so much, the madness which is epidemic in Britain, which I think is actually the epicenter of it, and in Europe, and which I think is now spreading further and further into the United States, at least at the geographical edges and in the universities. This is a phenomenon that is much discussed and analyzed. Well, I would like to talk today about one particular aspect of all this that really does jump out at me, and in a way it follows exactly from Alexandra's final question. Because what's really strange to me is that not just that this is a madness that has consumed so many people in the Western world, but that this hostility towards Israel is so much against the West's own self-interest. And even more striking to me is that this hostility to Israel is part of a pattern of self-destructive activity in the West. Let me start with Britain, which, as I say, I think is the epicenter of this hostility, where the animus against the political, intellectual class against Israel is really very distressing indeed. The British government, which insists that it is one of Israel's friends, also insists that the occupation and the settlements are illegal, by which it actually misrepresents, as far as I can see, both the Geneva Conventions and the unabrogated treaty obligations that Britain itself reneged upon to settle the Jews originally in what is now Israel, Judea and Samaria, and in Gaza. Britain's government played a key role in getting the European Union suddenly to label the produce from the disputed territories, as we've heard reference to a little earlier on. It's very quick to condemn Israeli military defense against attack as disproportionate, and it does absolutely nothing to counter the virulent campaign of demonization and delegitimization built on serial lies and libels that pours out of the media and the intellectual class virtually day after day. In the United States, the Obama administration blames Israel for scuppering the peace process while giving the Palestinian Authority a completely free pass for doing precisely that. We've seen and heard threats by both Kerry and Obama, threats to Israel that it risks being left completely friendless in the world. Obama has threatened that he will effectively desert it at the United Nations if Israel doesn't cave in to the PA demands, ignoring completely the PA's own incitement to hatred and murder of Jews. But here's the strange thing. Israel is absolutely vital to the security interests of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the West. In the United Kingdom, British intelligence services and its military work extremely closely with Israel. They really do understand that Israel's fight is their fight now against Islamic terrorism. They want and need and can't get enough of Israeli intelligence, Israeli military expertise, and Israeli military kit. They understand that Israel is the West's forward salient of defense in the Middle East and the West's only reliable ally. So what sense does it make for Britain to effectively, at the very same time, reward and incentivize those waging existential war against Israel? Puzzled by this, I recently asked an acquaintance of mine who's a member of the military and intelligence establishment in Britain and one of that establishment's rare public Israel defenders. I said to him, in your view, is the United Kingdom Israel's friend or Israel's enemy? And he thought for a very, very long time. And eventually he said, I cannot answer that question because it is both at the same time. Now, let's look at the church. In Britain, the Church of England, as with the Protestant progressive churches in America and elsewhere, these churches are virulently hostile to Israel. And this hostility, which is, as we heard earlier, theologically based, is now making inroads even into the United States evangelical churches, hitherto the absolute bedrock of Christian Zionism. As I've said, the hostility is theologically based. It's a return to the ancient Christian doctrine of supersessionism or replacement theology, in which it is therefore the case that these churches are standing not just against Israel, but against the Jewish people. I think it's next month in the United States, the Presbyterians' General Assembly will feature yet another attempt to divest from Israel in the wake of a document they produced earlier this year called Zionism Unsettled, a so-called study guide published by the Israel-Palestine Mission of the Church, which attacks the, in quotes, theological and ethical exceptionalism of Jewish and Christian Zionism, which have been sheltered from open debate despite the intolerable human rights abuses rooted in their core beliefs. Zionism, it suggests, has destroyed both indigenous Palestinian lives and Jewish communities across the globe in a supremacist misinterpretation of God's word on a par with, quote, Christian exceptionalist beliefs that contributed to the Nazi Holocaust, the genocide of Native Americans, and countless other instances of tragic brutality. In Britain, for its Christmas presentation to London, St. James's Church in Piccadilly, a hitherto unsung establishment in the very centre of tourist London, spent some months planning and some weeks executing the erection of an enormous wall. I think it was 60 foot by however many feet high. And this was the wall around Bethlehem. Within the church for a whole week, events went on under the title Bethlehem Unwrapped, devoted entirely to telling everybody of the crimes of Israel against the Palestinians and particularly against Bethlehem's Christians. And of course, it only takes one look at Bethlehem to see that there is no wall around Bethlehem. There is a part of the security barrier which is a wall for security reasons. The place that is walled in is Hebron in order to protect it, but no mention was made of, or only passing mention was made of the security needs of this so-called wall around Bethlehem in preserving and saving Israeli lives. Now here's the strange thing about the churches. They have exhibited these and many, many, many other instances or examples of theologically based, virulent, irrational hostility to Israel. But the strange thing is that at this very same time, Islamist groups are terrorizing and killing millions of Christians around the developing world. Open Doors, a non-denominational Christian group, says that about 100 million Christians are currently being persecuted in more than 65 countries, 36 of which this persecution is mainly coming from Muslims. There are so many examples one could give, none of them widely reported. Last week, a pregnant mother was sentenced to death in Sudan, thank you, for allegedly converting to Christianity. In Eritrea, more than 3,000 Christians are in prison. Last February, jihadists bombed churches in Zanzibar as dens of non-believers. In March, members of Somalia's al-Shabaab militia publicly beheaded a mother of 2 girls and her cousin after discovering they were Christians. The same month in Nigeria, more than 150 Christians were butchered in a massacre in Kaduna. This week, hundreds died in bomb attacks in the Christian areas in the towns of Kano and Jos. Yet about all this, the churches are silent. And the even more strange thing is that the one country where in the Middle East where Christians are safe and thriving is, of course, Israel. And yet, these churches blame Israel for Christian persecution. Bethlehem, for example, was once mainly Christian. Now, very tragically, it is a place where Christians are in a very significant minority, having been driven out by the Muslim administration. Yet the churches claim that the flight of the Bethlehem Christians is the result of the Israeli security barrier, or wall, and the checkpoints. One moment's thought would suggest that if the Palestinian Christians are being driven out of Bethlehem by the Israeli human rights abuses, why aren't Palestinian Muslims being driven out of Bethlehem too? To which, of course, the churches have no answer. At the very same time, these churches are dumping, theologically speaking, their Jewish roots and building bridges with Islam. Few Christian seminaries now expect their trainee priests to learn Hebrew. If they do study another religion, it's much more likely to be Islam. In the Church of England, major steps have been taken over many years to affirm Islam as a fellow Abrahamic faith, ignoring the absolutely fundamental differences between Judaism and Islam. In view of the fact that Islam is a supersessionist religion that wishes to supersede Christianity as well as Judaism, you could say that in this behavior, the Church is repudiating its own parent while embracing its assassin. Suicidal behavior indeed. In the United Kingdom, and more slowly, I would suggest also in the United States, these countries are caving in to people who are waging existential war against these societies in the form of radical Islam. London has long been hospitable to Islamic radicals. The British judiciary, which for many years has been obsessed by a concept of human rights, which I will come on to a little later, the judiciary has refused to deport foreign terrorist suspects on the basis that they risk ill treatment where they come from. London has become the terrorist financing and money laundering centre of the world. Not only did the country refuse to act against the Islamist terrorists or terrorist suspects in its midst, because the intelligence service years ago didn't take them seriously, or it did take them seriously, but it wanted them in the open where it thought it could be cleverer than them, it could use them, it could watch them, it could use them to lead them on to other people, it could turn them into double agents and triple agents. Not only did the intelligence services refuse to act, but more important still, because the intelligence service in Britain has now wised up to this to a large extent, much more important and devastating is that the United Kingdom government wants Islamic money. The former Chancellor of the Exchequer under Mr. Blair's Labour government, and then as Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, said, boasted, predicted that London would become the world centre for Islamic banking, which I think it probably now is, ignoring the connections between, for example, the zakat money or the tithed charitable Muslim donations and the Hamas and the Hezbollah, and ignoring that that control comes with this funding. The funding comes with conditions. So Britain is increasingly being bought up by the Islamic world. Saudi Arabia and other Islamic states are buying up university chairs in Islamic studies and thus controlling the curriculum. The Emirates own and name one of our football stadiums. The Emirates owns and names the Olympic cable car across the Thames. The state of Qatar owns Harrods and the auction house Christie's. It's financed an iconic skyscraper in London called the Shard. It helped buy the Olympic Village for £600 million. As a result, Qatar has been tirelessly courted by Downing Street, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the royal family. Meanwhile, the British government only recently has launched a public consultation on whether or not to introduce student loans that are compliant with Islamic Sharia law, which, as you may know, forbids loans that involve the payment of interest. Well, let's look at the United States, which only a few years ago was telling me how pleased they were and how complacent they were that this all was going on in benighted Britain, but it couldn't possibly happen in the United States. Well, the investigative project on terrorism has detailed how the White House has eliminated the term radical Islam and similar language in its counter-terrorist programs. It has also noted that jihadist terrorist organizations are effectively silencing discourse on college campuses and in the media that might offend followers of Islam. It points out that the Obama administration's chief partners in its outreach to the Muslim community are Islamist groups with Muslim Brotherhood origins, and that these relationships have given these groups unprecedented influence within the United States government while boosting their status as representatives of the Muslim American community. And yet, here's the mad thing. At the same time, these countries, as we know, are under permanent onslaught, assault, attack from the Islamic world. In Britain, the security service says there are currently at least 2,000 active known terror supporters, probably at least double their number. There are now currently 3 public inquiries going on into evidence that so many of our schools have been infiltrated by a Muslim conspiracy to take them over for radical Islamic teaching and practices. British Muslim women and girls are being subjected to horrific sexual violence, mutilation, and domination. Qatar's ties with the Muslim Brotherhood have made it a pariah even to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, and the Muslim Brotherhood is engaged in a twin track of cultural and terrorist onslaught against the West. But then here's the further crazy thing. Both the United States and the United Kingdom are empowering the Muslim Brotherhood and other similar Islamist enemies of the West in the Arab and Muslim world. Ousting Colonel Gaddafi in Libya has brought out Islamic extremists in Libya. Ousting President Mubarak in Egypt brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power. He was, President Morsi, the Brotherhood man who was installed, was, as you know, ousted by the Egyptians themselves, who demonstrated on the streets against Obama for having put this terrible religious fundamentalist in power. General Sisi, who is, to put it mildly, no Democrat and no angel, is being undermined at this moment by the United States, who basically are refusing to cooperate with him because he is considered to be so extreme, unlike, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, whose candidate the United States supported. And the United States, above all, is currently empowering Iran and enabling Iran to progress unimpeded towards the production of nuclear weapons. Everywhere in the Middle East and the Arab and Muslim world, President Obama is rewarding and incentivizing the enemies of the West and abandoning or punishing its allies. And that's before we get on to the Palestinians. Now, I suggest that this is the equivalent of, the political equivalent of autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease, as you know, disables and even kills human beings by effectively the body confusing its enemies with its friends. It embraces the enemies of the body that's going to attack the body while attacking those organisms that are friendly to the body and constitute its defense. It is potentially fatal. And in attacking Israel and the West's Arab allies and empowering their enemies, the West is engaged, I would suggest, in a political form of autoimmune disease. So the question is how to explain this perversity. Well, I think that it is rooted in the fact that the West's cultural and political establishment has turned against itself in a very wide sense. And you can see this, to exemplify this, you can see this in the trajectory of human rights doctrine, the human rights law. Now, it is astonishing to me that Israel finds itself on the wrong side of the human rights argument. Israel is completely bonkers about human rights. It has a court that is extreme in its devotion to human rights. And yet Israel is demonized by human rights NGOs, damned by the International Court of Justice. Its people are treated as war criminals when they are running the most moral military in the world, and its civil society is so regulated by human rights-obsessed civil courts. But then human rights in general has become a weapon of war not just against Israel, but a weapon of the culture war in the United Kingdom and the wider world. We can see this through the United Nations. The United Nations supposedly embodies this thinking that the world body is committed to global peace and justice. But we can see the United Nations Human Rights Council, and before that its Commission on Human Rights, is an absolute farce because it's dominated by human rights abusers who use cynically the Western language of human rights to defeat the West. Now, they use this to protect themselves against the criticism that they are themselves human rights abusers. But the big question is, why does the West let them get away with it? How has the West allowed the UN to turn human rights into this travesty? And the answer is that the concept of human rights itself has gone very badly wrong. It's been hijacked, and through the abuse and exercise of international law, human rights law has been turned into a vehicle for injustice, because it doesn't cover fundamental human rights at all, but a highly contingent set of formulae for certain groups to exercise power over other groups. And far from protecting Western civilization, it's turned into its potential nemesis. And the way human rights has changed, I think, illustrates or helps illuminate our concerns today. Human rights law was drafted in the wake of the Second World War as a very explicit attempt to lay down a set of principles to ensure that totalitarianism would never again deface Europe. In the shadow of fascism and Stalinism, its aim was to protect the individual from the state. Now, my view is that the very act of codifying these rights changed them radically, because codification limits liberty. In my view, and I am an Anglophile in this respect, the truest form of liberty is found in the English common law, in which everything was, past tense, was permitted unless prohibited. Codifying human rights moved from negative liberty, freedom from something, to positive liberty. And that gave judges the power to arbitrate about what was permitted and what was forbidden. More importantly, and I'm rattling through this because I've only got 3 minutes to sum up the decline and collapse of Western civilization. But anyway, human rights law has been turned into a vehicle for culture change. The culture that changed was it changed from the biblical-based concept of duty to others to my rights rule everyone else. What is right for me becomes what is right. And as a result of this, nobody could say that their values trumped anyone else's. So the West couldn't say that liberal values trumped illiberal values, and no one could say that the nation became a source of illegitimacy. The Western nation became a source of real illegitimacy because the West was in the business of colonializing and exploiting other people. And unfortunately, Israel became damned several times over. It was a nation, bad, judgmental. It was a Western nation, terrible, colonialist. It was a racist nation consisting of Jews. That can't possibly be allowed. And what's more, it was a Western racist nation that actually went to war to defend that triply damned existence and killed people in the process. So one question remains, and here I will conclude. But it's a rather long question. Why did the West turn against itself? And there are many reasons for this. And there are 6 reasons I will give, and I will say them as quickly as I possibly can. Why did the West turn against itself in this way? Right. First of all, there was the dominance for the last 50 years of the 60s baby boomers who, after World War II, adopted the cultural leftist agenda of the Long March through the institutions as a very explicit program of undermining the West. Apropos, there is President Obama, who brings to this particular party not just a background in radical leftism, but a view of the world in which I think he's been quite explicit. He wants to even up what he considers to be a terrible imbalance between the West and the rest. The West had power, the rest suffered, so you even up the imbalance by basically dumping on the West and giving the rest power instead. So he's very explicitly empowering the enemies of the West in order to be fair. The third thing was the tide of secularism, which has swept the Western world, to which many of our churches have been lamentably unable to resist for various reasons. And then there is the turning against the nation. The nation is illegitimate, and that came as a result of the Holocaust. The nation led to nationalism, nationalism led to Hitler. Hello? But that's how it went. Get rid of the nation, you have the brotherhood of man, we all cooperate, we get rid of bigotry from the human heart, we're all happy. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out like that. And it's no accident, I think, that the ideologies that have come in the wake of the collapse of the religious narrative, whatever ideologies they are, multiculturalism, environmentalism, all the isms, they're all basically utopian. And I think that we're getting to the heart of the hostility to the Jews. Because what happens, we know from the medieval period, the period when there were utopian millenarians who believed that the perfection of the world was about to happen. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen. And what happened was they made scapegoats, and they turned on those scapegoats in their fury and their rage and their grief that the perfection of the world hadn't happened. Well, since our rational world is furious that the Enlightenment hasn't produced utopia. It hasn't produced an end to war, an end to prejudice, an end to bigotry. Something has gone terribly wrong. And so, once again, there is a search for scapegoats. And who are they scapegoating? The people who gave the West its core beliefs, the Jews. It's no accident the Jews are at the very center of this, and that the Jewish state is at the very center of it. In other words, the West has turned against the religion that underpins freedom and reason at the very core of Western civilization. In turning against Israel, it's turned against itself. Can the West therefore pull back from the brink? Well, who knows? History tells us surely that some cultures, faced with a precipice, pull back. Other cultures go straight over. I believe personally that all is not lost, although the difficulties for all of us are immense and are increasing, but we must just keep on keeping on.
Thank you, Melanie. We'll take a few questions. Let me just make one remark. One of the basics is that you cannot fool all the people all the time, even if you are a Muslim. So I think that if we come here back in 10 years, the situation will be very different, and the exposure of Islam and the exposure of the nonsense that there is one Islam and the alternative that there are in essence two types of people. You have a relatively small radical Islam, and next to that all the others are moderates. All this nonsense will be gone over a period of time. So I open the floor. Who wants to ask something? Ben?
Yeah, I have a question, partly provoked by something Melanie was talking about with the UN. I recently wrote an article where I said that the Zionism as Racism resolution was never really abolished, because you still have this infrastructure of the UN operated by the Division for Palestinian Rights, which is a centre for BDS and other delegitimization campaigns. Somebody I spoke to said to me that these mandates get renewed every year, and if only the Europeans would, if only European heads of state would instruct their ambassadors to vote against the renewal of these mandates, we could get rid of this Palestinian propaganda infrastructure. So my question to you guys is, how likely is it, do you think, that heads of state would instruct their ambassadors in New York to vote against the renewal of these mandates?
Okay, who wants to answer this? Melanie?
I think it's exceptionally unlikely that Western leaders will do that, because the United Nations is sanctified. They cannot go to war without the imprimatur of the United Nations. The United Nations embodies disinterested global justice. I think there is hope in the developing world. If Israel were to play its cards more intelligently, it would understand or exploit the fact that in the developing world, in Africa and other such countries, there are literally millions and millions of Christians, and they are increasing exponentially, who are extremely devoted to Israel and anxious about its survival, because they understand the role that Israel plays in safeguarding them. And they are a global army that can be deployed at the United Nations. Israel needs to do much more in helping those countries, in helping them in their infrastructure and so on, much, much more. It has to really love bomb them in order to activate properly that global army. That's where the reform of the United Nations will come from, if at all.
Giselle, and then Evi.
Yeah, Europe cannot abolish the UNRWA, because the next day there will be a tremendous reprisal and terrorism throughout Europe. Europe has taken this position, the Palestinization of its whole society and civilization, which is equal to the Islamization, because it cannot do otherwise. And what we are seeing now is the result of the decision that was taken that Israel is always wrong and that Europe is on the side of the Palestinians. There is no way to discuss it. You cannot rationalize that. Europe has closed itself into a bubble of lies that are based on the Palestinian Nakba and its own willing Islamization. Europe has decided to Islamize itself through the Mediterranean ideology and rules and institutions that govern us through network, to international networks which the people even don't know their existence. However, they rule us, our laws and also our policies.
Amy?
I'll just be very short. Your question presupposes the importance of individualized member states speaking. Now there is a common foreign policy as represented by Baroness Ashton, the EU foreign representative. We have to pay very serious attention because she now, and whomever will follow her, will speak for all 28 member states, and they have made it very, very clear going back to the guidelines that I mentioned in my talk. So no, I don't think it's possible, unfortunately.
Yes, and please introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Has anyone surveyed this worldwide battle or war against anti-Semitism? Has anyone looked at those skirmishes where there are victories as compared to those where there are defeats, and do any debriefing as to the lessons learned from what works and what does not work to achieve some victories, even if they're transient, or even if they're not so transient?
Is there anybody who wants to answer? Otherwise, I'll answer if there is
I
no
have answered.
Well,
What did he say?
what's the issue? There have been victories, there have been two. The Israeli government mobilized all the Jewish organizations. Durban II, which took place in Geneva, it marginalized the NGOs. But because Israel has no central anti-propaganda body against the war, they fight on an individual issue, and they were defeated on other major issues like Kairos and the Goldstone Report. So we have a structure to fight a military war, which is Tzahal. We have a structure to fight an intelligence war, which has three structures: Aman, Shin Bet, Mossad. We have a structure now to fight the cyber war. And crazily enough, we are the only nation which hasn't a structure to fight the propaganda war. So there are successes, but there is no body which can learn anything from it. Last question, Rabbi Cooper.
Yes, Manfred, I actually like for everyone to take a brief moment on it, as well as yourself. Just a quick reflection on the elections, European elections that took place.
Yeah, you want to ask something, Dina? If it's an amendment on the existing question, it's possible.
We heard this quite depressing, excellent, but quite depressing lecture. According to which we are going towards one dead end, and these processes cannot be undone. But the elections to the European Parliament, which were such a success for right-wingers, who are against precisely that, precisely this domination of Islam and the millions of Muslim immigrants, etc., perhaps can change the picture.
Any answers, Giselle?
Yes.
Yeah.
we can only we have to change the situation, because the people who have created this situation, this Europe, are our leaders. There are the European Council. They are the leaders of the state. There are our intellectuals. There are the people from the European Union, the leader of the European Union and of the Commission, the European Commission. So all, they have names, they have authority, they are human beings. These people have to go out in order that things change, that Europe come to itself. But how this fight will develop, we don't know. But the first thing to do is to destroy, to try to destroy, like Nigel Farage said, to try to destroy this type of Europe, which is run by bureaucrats, by anti-Semites, by Islamized people, Islamized church, by the Palestinian ideology and the theocracy. We have to get rid of all this in order to find out again the soul of Europe.
Alexandra?
Yes, well, still, I mean, in France, for instance, the one who won the election was the extreme right party, the National Front. And the National Front is surfing for its success on the rejection of Europe, but also on this new rhetoric of Islamized Europe. We are occupied by Muslim people and we have to fight against it. So it's not very good news either. I mean, I don't know if I prefer a bureaucrat, a technocrat, or that kind of thing.
Well, but all what you have said show that Europe is Islamized. All Europe
demonstration. Look, we're not going to have at this late hour a discussion, Melanie.
I think it's. I have two things to say about these elections. The first is that it is a great.
No, because I already have other questions.
This is the moment when the people of Britain and various other countries said, we want democracy back. We want self-government back. Now, if they get it back, and I believe that the European Union is a counter-democratic movement, if the nation-state recovers and people start to get self-government again, then I think that a lot of the pride and a lot of the demoralization will go away. And it will be to the advantage of all of us, as Giselle has said. However, there are, as Alexandra has suggested, there are grave dangers. One of the most alarming things I've heard said to me some years ago from a wise person who has studied Islamic societies and Islamization for a long time. He said, what's going to happen in Europe is it's going to be a war between European fascists and Islamofascists. And what side are we going to be on? I didn't find that the most consoling prognosis I've heard. But I do actually think there is an element of truth in that. There are some of these parties that are coming to power now are people that we would not wish to consort with. And it's going to be very difficult to work our way through this. But the really important thing we've got to hold on to is that they are tapping into, they themselves may be objectionable parties. They themselves may be truly racist people. But they're tapping into something which is terribly important in the countries of Europe, which is the desire for people to govern themselves according to their own cultures, according to their own democratic parliaments. And that is a great thing to get back. And that's the kind of thing, that's the principle we should hang on to, and that's the hopeful sign of these elections.
Look, I think...
Huntington is back.
What?
Huntington.
No, sure, hunting, of course, but look, the issue is that if you read the European papers, they all concentrate on this new possible gathering of the 7 right-wing parties and whether they'll do that. The situation is infinitely more complicated because the situation becomes far more chaotic after the elections of yesterday. You have people who do not fit the classical right-wing definition. The Grillini in Italy with 25% of the votes. They are not a classical right-wing movement. Even Wilders isn't a classical right-wing movement because it's socially on the left. You have UKIP, which changed its policy overnight after its success. Yesterday they were for the exit of the UK from Europe. Today they are for the abolishment of Europe, as Farage said today. You have on the left suddenly Tsipras of Syriza, who in fact replaces the Socialist Party, PASOK, in Greece. And he is besides being an anti-Israeli, he is also an anti-European. So this isn't a field which is very, very transparent, and we simply will have to follow it in the coming year, how it works out. Now, I know there are other questions, and I apologize to those people, but I want to end on time according to what is said here. I'm sure that the panelists will gladly speak to each of you in private. Thank you so much.